This is definitely a more intermediate painting subject, but if you break it up into a couple different days, I think you're going to be surprised at what you can do. For those of you who are not familiar with my tutorials, you can pause the video and refer to the video description for a complete list of the materials I'll be using in today's lesson. It's often the same materials, so once you familiarize yourself, it's pretty self-explanatory. These are the paint colors we'll be using for today's painting. You don't need these exact colors, but if you do want to know what they are, pause the video and refer to the video description. Also in the video description is a line drawing as well as a reference photo that you can download and print at home. If you've never done a transfer before, I want you to print the line drawing out at the scale you plan on painting it. And on the back of the line drawing, I want you to use a number 4 or number 6B drawing pencil to apply graphite to the back side of the line drawing. Position it so that the graphite comes in contact with the surface of your watercolor paper and tape it in position. Use a ballpoint pen to then carefully trace any lines that you feel like are essential to kind of help give clarity to you during the painting process. Just from the pressure of your pen, it's going to transfer the lines onto your paper. If the lines are too soft, you need to press harder. If the lines are too black, you need to press lighter. You're going for just a medium gray. Once you've transferred all of your lines, you can then remove your line drawing so we can begin. Before I begin any painting, I really like to take a look at my pencil lines from the drawing to make sure they are not too dark or too light. If I'm concerned about any lines being too dark, I use a kneaded eraser to just lightly tap the top surface of those dark pencil lines to lighten them up. If you're using graphite transfer paper, depending on the brand, you may discover that these transfer lines will not lift as easily as if you were to use a standard pencil for the transfer. So just be cautious of that. Any pencil lines that are along areas of my subject where the colors are more of a rich black or dark brown, I don't worry about lightening them so much. However, any pencil lines that are up against areas where I plan on having some vibrant whites, those pencil lines, on the other hand, I do make sure to soften a bit. Before I begin a painting, I also want to make sure that I am mindful of any bright whites that are small and delicate and may be difficult to avoid with my paintbrush. So I'm going to use masking fluid to apply to any of those bright whites to protect them. Masking fluid can damage your brush though, so I like to put a small amount of water with some dish soap in it just to add a layer of soapy water to the bristles of my paintbrush so I can protect my tools. Throughout the process of applying masking fluid, I rinse frequently in this soapy water to ensure my brush doesn't get ruined. So for today's subject with the fox, I'm going to be applying some thin, wispy lines with the use of my masking fluid, just to maintain some of the bright whites that are in my subject. I'm being mindful of the negative space. I'm not trying to completely color in and fill the end of the tail. I just want to get some thin, wispy lines with the masking fluid so that it'll look like I have bright whites that can pop forward later. But if I go too thick and I won't have that negative space and it won't look fluffy. I've gone a short distance with my masking fluid, so I'm now going to rinse my brush really well in that soapy water for added protection while I re-dip in my masking fluid and continue. Also, because of the light source on this fox, I have some bright whites that are just ever so thin around the edge of the head. I also have some bright white fur in the very back of my fox. If I have too much masking fluid on my paintbrush, the lines will be really thick. So if I need to thin out my lines, I need to remove some of that masking fluid and thin it out. I also like the idea of masking the eyes of any animals I'm painting, just to ensure that I can have full control over the details of the eyes and not completely lose them. There's also some small little white wispy hairs in the ear and along the edge of the ear. I'm re-rinsing my brush in that soapy water to protect it and continuing to apply masking fluid. There are some additional little white wispy hairs in this forward ear here. On the back edge of the paw, since our fox is backlit, there's this ever so thin white glow that's being created. So I'm trying to be very gentle with my brush so my masking is very narrow in these areas. I'm intentionally dabbing my brush and kind of dotting it when I'm applying the masking fluid in some areas where there's fur. I think this just helps kind of add texture to my subject rather than dragging my brush in a solid line, because I feel like that will make my animal look a little bit more plastic and ceramic. And I would prefer to have a fuzzy texture to my finished painting. So I try to be mindful of how I apply my masking fluid and mimic the texture of my subject. On the very back side of the fox, there's a lot of wonderful bright whites. So I'm trying to just follow the direction of the fur while not overloading my paintbrush with masking fluid so my lines are thinner and a little on the wispy side. And I'm trying to vary the length of the hairs so it doesn't look symmetrical. Also on the rock and wood, there are some bright whites because of the light source as well. And I'm just kind of mimicking the texture and direction of the wood grain as I apply the masking fluid. It's been a while since I've rinsed my brush in that soapy water, so I'm going to do so now before I re-dip in my masking fluid and continue. Trying to allow spacing between my masking fluid so it will read like wood bark later when I remove it. Rinsing the masking fluid out of my brush before I continue. On the forward side of my rock, just on this right face, there are some whites. So I am starting off with the edges of this rock face. Again, dotting my brush and dragging my brush in kind of different irregular strokes. Extending that masking fluid down off my watercolor block so it actually fills the entire space. I'm going to rinse all the masking fluid out of my brush. We have the face of a rock on the far left here. It's smaller, but that right face leaning towards our light source is quite bright as well. So I'm just going to add some textured masking fluid on that face. And although my line drawing doesn't extend the full width of my block, I am going to make the choice to extend my masking fluid to be a little wider. The rock that's right behind it doesn't have as many bright whites, but it does have some, but they're mostly hugging the line on the right edge. So that's where I'm applying it for the most part. And then right on the top of this larger rock in the foreground, there's a little bit of bright whites just on the top, but they're very narrow and minimal. Between the rocks and the log, there's just a peak of some whites from some background elements. So I'm adding those. It's been a while since I've rinsed my brush, so I'm going to rinse it now. Right on the very top edge of the ears, there's this very thin amount of light that kind of just makes the top edge of the ear glow against the dark background, which is really lovely. So I'm going to try and capture that as well. Okay, so while the masking fluid is drying, I've rinsed the masking fluid out of my brush really well. And I'm going to set that soapy water aside, and I'm going to do one step further of rinsing the soap out of my brush. Soapy water and paints don't really go hand in hand. So I have my 10 well paint palette here. I'm going to grab my number 10 round brush, make sure it's clean, and I'm going to use this brush to transfer water over to different wells of my paint palette. I'm going to be applying a large wet into wet application of color all over this subject. So I'm going to need quite a few different colors, and I like to have them ready in advance just so I don't have to mix on the fly and feel like I'm always playing catch up. So one of the first colors I'm going to be using is a dark cadmium yellow. This is going to be on the lighter areas of the fur where the sun is kind of creating this glow on the orange fur of the fox. Anytime I feel like my color might be right, I'm going to grab a scrap piece of paper and test it out. I always want my color to be about 20% darker than the end goal when it dries. The other color I will be using is going to involve the lemon yellow with some added sap green. This will be used in the areas of the plant textures that the light is shining off of. So it's very much a lime green. I'm going to rinse that out of my brush, and I'm now using my large round brush to get a cadmium orange. I'm going to do a few variations of this orange, so I'm going to be taking cadmium orange and putting it in 3 different wells, so I can kind of adjust the color by adding others. So right now, this is my cadmium orange. One of them I'm going to leave as is, but the other 2 I'm going to darken. I'm going to add some ultramarine blue to one of the oranges, and it's going to make kind of this darker, dingier orange. If it goes too close to a brown, I can always add more orange to balance it out. So this is kind of the orange I'm going for. The third orange, I do want to be closer to the brown side, so I'm going to actually add some burnt umber to it. And I'm also going to add a little bit of that ultramarine blue. I want this color to be darker. This will be more for my shadows, so it's on the brown side. I'm also going to mix up some burnt umber by itself, but I'm going to have it watered down. This will be for some of the wood. I also want to have some Payne's Gray mixed up, but on a lighter value for some soft grays that are in the subject. And then the last 2 colors I'm going to have are going to be much darker in value because they're going to be more for the background. So one will be a much darker Payne's Gray. The other one is going to be a much darker ultramarine blue. I'm going to add a little bit of Payne's Gray to it to gray it out a little bit more though. So these are going to be the colors for parts of the background. If you need some time to get your colors together, you can pause the video just so you can kind of catch up. I am going to just put a small amount of these colors on this paper here so you kind of know all the colors I've put together. So pause the video while you finish mixing up your paint colors, and then go ahead and resume when you're ready to paint with me. Now that my paint colors are all mixed up and ready to go, I am going to take a large flat brush and apply clean water all over my paper. This will help even out the sizing compound that's on the surface of our watercolor paper. And a large flat brush just makes things go much faster. The initial water, when we apply it, will absorb rather quickly into the fibers of the paper. So I like to kind of fill the entire paper with water, but then I wait a moment and I let that water kind of seep in to the cotton paper. And then once I see it starting to thin out, I apply a second layer and let that absorb in additionally, just to ensure I have working time. So I'm going to pause the video while I do that, just to make sure we have enough water absorbed into the paper. I've applied water a couple times to my paper, allowing it time to kind of absorb into the fibers, just to ensure it's as saturated as I can get it. Now, I want you to be mindful that there are no puddles on my paper. Okay? Puddles and excess water make it very difficult for us to control where our paint is going to go. It's also going to dilute our colors, so they're less vibrant and very washed out. So make sure you absorb excess water from your paper before applying your paint colors. Now, I am going to do a very quick and messy application of paint just to make sure I get a base color in. I will be leaving the details of the fox towards the end. That way I give the water some time to absorb into the fibers of the paper, giving me more control to ensure that the paint kind of stays where I intend for it to be. So I'm going to start off with the brown kind of fall grasses that are over on this left edge near the rocks. So I'm essentially tracing where some of these fall grasses might be. And I plan on using masking fluid to kind of protect these fall grasses while I do a wash on the background. Right now it doesn't make much sense, but if you just kind of mimic this texture I'm creating, it'll make sense later. So just get some soft oranges in, have different heights to your fall grasses, and make sure you extend them down to the rock. I'm also going to have just some hints of softer fall grasses in the background behind this log. Now I'm going to rinse my brush, dry it off, and I'm going to grab some of that watered down ultramarine blue. And on parts of this dry wood, I'm going to be applying this color. Notice how I'm not tapping my brush the whole way. I'm dragging my brush the full length of the wood, and that just ensures I have a little bit more control over where this paint is going. The more I lift my brush up, the more random the paint will be. Because anytime you lift your paintbrush up, it tends to want to leave a little circular blob. So I'm finding the shadows of my rocks and applying this soft blue to them. I'm not afraid of going right over top of some of that masking fluid. Same with the masking fluid on the front face. I'm not afraid of going right on top of it. I'm going to rinse that soft blue out of my brush. I'm now going to get some of that lime green. And this is another plant I plan on using some masking fluid techniques on. So I'm just kind of following maybe the branch direction of this plant. Right now it looks really bizarre. But once you see the masking fluid technique I'm going to use, it's going to make more sense. So I'm just extending this plant up off the page, even though my line drawing didn't. And I have some of those brighter greens in the background as well behind my fox. Now you'll notice that the sheen on my fox has changed. Okay, it's not dry, but it's definitely soaked into the paper. This is where I have a lot of control, but I need to move fast. I'm using my number 6 round with my cadmium yellow. And I'm applying it to the lightest areas of the fox's fur that are in the sunlight. I'm staying pretty far away from where I want my color transitions. So I'm essentially trying to give the paint some space to kind of move and expand. But because I'm at this beautiful happy medium stage, my paint isn't traveling as far. If my paper was too wet, it would expand much further than I intend. So anywhere I feel like that light source is very strong, I give a little touch of these yellows too. Now that I have the yellows in, I'm going to be very mindful of where the white fur is on my fox. I don't want to accidentally just go on autopilot and cover that all up. I'm using the bright cadmium orange. And again, my goal is just to get kind of a base layer of color on my fox. Using a smaller brush will ensure that your brush releases less color, giving you more control, but it also slows you down. So you have to kind of find what works for you. And sometimes we just need to embrace the process and give ourselves permission to try. And if nothing else, we're going to learn in the process. So I'm adding this orange where I want it, trying to move fast. If I need some additional working time, I can use an ultrafine mist water sprayer and do a distant but light mist on my paper if I feel like things are drying. Just keep in mind, every time you mist your paper, you are essentially lightening and washing out your colors. I'm now going to get the orange with the added ultramarine blue to try and create some of the shadows that are along the hip area of my fox. And there's definitely some darker colors on that tail and neck. But again, I'm trying to be very mindful of where my whites are so I don't go too dark. I'm going to use my really watered down gray. And I want this to be very, very faint. So make sure you add additional water if there's any hesitation. And the white fur that is on the neck area here is actually in shadow. So although our brain knows it's supposed to be white fur when it's in shadow, it should have a soft kind of blue-gray tone to it. So I need to add that in here just for the base color. I'm now going to switch to my smaller brush to give myself more control. I'm using that orange with the ultramarine blue added. And right underneath the eye here, we have some additional orange on the fox. It kind of carries up and over the eye. This orange carries up into some of the ear, in between the ears on the head. Because we're at this little happy stage, our color is a little more easily controlled as long as it is just mildly damp still. If your paper's already dried, the quality of your paper may be a factor, or the amount of water or paste you're painting may be a factor. It all just takes practice. I'm continuing to use this darker orange with the ultramarine to just get some colors in where I need them. But I'm trying to move quickly so I can at least get those essential colors in first. I'm going to grab the darkest orange, which is more of a brown, for in areas of the tail. Keeping my strokes short so it kind of mimics the fur texture in the fox. Using this dark brown on the rear leg that is very much in shadow as well. Things are beginning to dry just a little bit, so I'm doing a light mist. You can always pause the video or fast forward to help you with your pace. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. Being very mindful of my shadows that are around the legs so that they pop forward and don't get camouflaged. On the end of this tail, it is white, but I can add that watered down gray to it. And taking a moment to study my photo, make sure there's color where I need it to be. I'm going to grab some of that bright orange just to darken up some of the color in some areas that I feel like might have gotten washed out. I'm going to add some of this bright orange on the back edge of the legs near the light source. I can grab some of my blue-gray that is on the darker side to add to the ears since they're at this wonderful stage where the paint isn't moving super far. Can add a little bit to the side cheek. I'm now going to get that darker Payne's gray. And I don't want to go too close to my pencil edges with it because I want to maintain control of where it's going. But I can add some of this color to the feet. But notice how I start in the center of the leg and I pause to see how far the paint's going to actually move and travel before I decide to go in and add more of this color. All right, there's definitely areas where my paper is dry because I'm getting hard edges. So I need to get out and let this dry. All additional details can happen on the next layer. But because we did this initial first layer of wet into wet, at least we have gotten a lot of wonderful color transition and blends in that would have otherwise taken a long time painting wet on dry the whole thing. I'm constantly reading the shine of my paper to see if I have more working time in some areas before I go in and add paint color. All right, this is all I can really get done on this first layer. I'm going to hit this with the blow dryer so we can apply some masking fluid and then get that rich background to make things pop. Now that things are completely dry, I'm going to apply some additional masking fluid just so I have peace of mind when I paint this bold background. I want this background to be dark and I want the fox to pop forward. So I'm going to use masking fluid to help me out with this goal. Now, masking fluid, when you apply it to dry paint, it will lift a very small amount of the value of your paint color. So just keep that in mind. So I'm going to essentially apply masking fluid in some areas of the fur, but mostly I'm going to be focusing on the plants. So I have these tall, narrow, kind of dry grasses. So I'm using my brush and trying my best in one stroke to paint that thin stem of each grass. Hold your brush more vertical. Challenge yourself to drag your brush across your paper where just the very end of your brush touches the paper but does not bend the bristles of your brush. That's going to help you get those thin, narrow lines that are otherwise challenging. If your lines are coming out really wide, you're pressing down too hard. You got to lighten your pressure and hold your brush more vertically. It's been a while since I've rinsed my brush, so I'm going to do that now. And then I'm going to re-dip in my masking fluid and continue. I'm going to use my liner brush with masking fluid to get some thinner lines, but I do need to protect it with my soapy water. So this is just a #1 script liner brush, which is really great for thin, long lines. I make sure to wipe away the excess masking fluid from my brush before I pull my lines. I like to also have some grass blades going in different directions. Once I have those vertical grass blades in, then I can start adding some of the texture I see at the end of the grasses, so where the seeds are. So I'm going to use my number 2 round brush that has a little bit more of a blunt edge to it. And just at the end of the grass blades, I'm going to try to maintain staying in the areas where I already have orange. But I'm essentially doing these small little dot-like textures at the very end. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. Now I'm going to apply some masking fluid to the edges of my fox. So I feel like getting into really narrow, tight areas like around the legs is kind of a difficult thing to maintain. So sometimes adding masking fluid in those areas so you have peace of mind can be helpful. So if you look here, I've just kind of masked around some negative space that is between the legs just to make sure I can capture that shape. I'm going to mask around exterior edges of the fox just to ensure I can kind of capture this fur-like texture, but it doesn't slow me down. Especially in the area of the tail. I want to have that long hair texture there. So I'm just following the direction of the texture, keeping my lines thin and wispy, and my lines aren't even all in contact with each other. That's okay. It's been a while since I've rinsed my paintbrush, so I'm going to do that now. I am going to mask the outer edge of the fox's ear. I'm going to try and capture some of that hair-like texture on the back of the fox, following the direction of the hair in my reference photo. So I've essentially masked around the outer edge of my fox while maintaining that textured fur with my masking fluid application. Last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to mask some areas of this plant in the lower right corner. So on this plant to the right, I'm going to mask just some of the pine needle texture. So I have the main stems of this little evergreen bush, and I'm now essentially just going to apply some pine needle-like texture going around that stem. Notice how my dashed lines are varying in length and height. And I'm keeping these lines more towards the top end of the branch and the right edge towards my light source. And I'm kind of pulling these pine needles at a diagonal down towards the branch. Once you have masked some of those pine needles, really get a good rinse of your brush, get all that masking fluid out. And we are going to move on to painting the background. Now for this background, we do want dark, rich colors. So I want to make sure that I have enough paint mixed up on my palette for this whole background. So just a reminder, our background colors are these two here. Okay, we do want them mixed up to be that dark. I'm going to use my large flat brush to add water to just the background. I will not be bringing it down too low across my grass blades as well as my pine needles. I'm okay with bringing that water right up to the edge of my masking fluid around my fox. I'm going to do my best to not hit the wood with my water. If I need to switch to a small brush when I am adding water to these narrow spaces, I can. So I'm going to take a moment to look, give my paper a side glance to check the sheen, see if there's any areas Where my background is already beginning to dry, that might need a second layer. But once I'm confident that everything has been saturated with water, then I can remove the excess puddles of water just to ensure I don't completely dilute my color, because I do want it to be dark. I don't want it all to be too soft. So I'm going to tip my paper to show you what the sheen looks like after I've removed the puddles, because those puddles are just going to wash out all the color and it's going to fade and not be as dark as I'd like. So really make sure you soak up those puddles. Having a quality watercolor brush really helps soak up the water quickly. All right, so if I tip my paper, you can see it's definitely glossy, but there's no standing puddles. So I'm ready to add my background color now. So I'm using my large number 10 round. I am going to start with my blue-gray, and I'm going to start around my fox because that's very much my focal point. And I want to take my time around the fox so I don't move too quickly. I don't want to risk splashing him or messing him up. So I'm just taking my time, going around the fox slowly and carefully. Notice how I'm not bringing the dark gray all the way down to the top of the wood in this central area. And that's because I want some hints of color there so it looks like there's plants behind that fallen wood piece. Okay, now that I've gone around the fox, I need to get around these plants. So I'm okay with kind of going in between the branches. I don't feel the need to kind of cover everything. Same with the grasses on the left. So I'm kind of going down and in between some of the grasses. But notice how I'm changing my heights. So I can go completely over top of the ends of the grasses. If there's anywhere where I have a hard edge because I ran into dry paper, I can just rinse my brush and tap a sponge so it's just damp with clean water, and I can bring clean water into this area to soften that edge so it kind of blends. Now that I've softened everything down here, I can actually rinse my brush and grab some of the darker orange that has the added blue in it. And I can dab some of that in here over top of everything. So it kind of reads like some faded, blurred grass blades behind everything. Same with on the ground behind the log. Now the upper left and right corners are beginning to dry rather quickly, so I need to get some paint in there. When I add this color to the background, I'm not trying to be even about it. I'm trying to create just interesting shapes. I'm just adding a little bit of dark orange in this bottom right corner where those evergreen plants are. I'm going to add a little bit of those lime greens. I can use water to kind of soften any brushstroke edges that are in areas where I don't want them. I still have quite a bit of working time, so I can come in here with some other colors and maybe richer blacks to make some areas pop a little bit more. If I want the fox's head to pop more, I can definitely add some darks around it. Notice how it's not a dotted texture that I'm creating. I'm creating different shapes, different sizes wherever I go. I can also add some of this orange brown that I used on the fur to parts of the background. So it looks like there is some faded plants in the background behind the fox. The nose is quite black on the fox, and I don't want that to be camouflaged by the background. So I'm making a point to kind of soften the color around that nose so that nose will have the opportunity to stand out. Otherwise, I feel like that background is a great place to stop. So I'm going to hit this with the blow dryer before I can proceed with the other details. Now we are going to apply a little bit more masking fluid to areas of the chest of the fox, as well as some of the grasses here, so we can achieve a little bit more of a three-dimensional effect. So get that soapy water in front of you again for the masking fluid. Grab your small brush, probably your number 2. And on the neck of the fox, I now want to apply masking fluid in areas where even the fur in shadow is the brightest. I want to make sure my brush is not overloaded with too much masking fluid. And I'm especially paying particular attention to the fur that's around the neck. I'm going to rinse my brush in the soapy water to protect it. And I'm going to re-dip in my masking fluid. I'm now going to follow, there's kind of like these little clusters of fur that are kind of grouped together, going down at a diagonal because of the fox's head being turned. So I'm just trying to mimic that angle so I can kind of mask little groups or clusters of hair going in that direction. There is some spacing between these little clusters that are quite a bit darker, so I'm kind of allowing that spacing between my masking fluid. I'm going to add a little bit of masking fluid to the grasses here. I'm essentially layering these grasses so it gives more dimension. I'm now going to rinse all of the masking fluid out of my brush, and I'm going to rinse the soap then out of my brush and set that aside. Now I'm going to focus on adding additional details to the fur of the fox. But in order to kind of identify where I need to add, I'm going to remove the masking fluid from the majority of the fox, all except for the hairs along the neck. So I'm using my rubber cement pickup. I'm staying away from the neck. I don't want to remove any of that. I notice there's a small little triangle in here that I forgot to paint with a background color, so I'm going to do that now. While that's drying, I'm going to give that area some space. I'm not removing any masking fluid from the log or wood that the fox is standing on. While that little V shape is drying, I'm going to remove the masking fluid from the evergreen plant. And you'll see that by applying it on top of the dry lime green paint, it's preserved that, which is really wonderful. I often run my fingers across my paper to see if I feel any bumps, indicating masking fluid that got missed. This little triangle in here has dried. Okay, now the masking fluid I applied to the grasses on the left, those details are not going to show unless I do another layer of color in here. So I'm going to get my brush wet with clean water. I'm going to keep the water kind of midway through the grasses, going around the rock. I can now grab that dark orange that was nearly brown. And towards the bottom edge of my water, I'm applying that brown color. When I get close to that rock, I'm going to really slow down. Keep in mind, puddles are going to make it difficult to control where your paint goes. So dry your brush off on a paper towel or sponge to absorb that excess puddling paint. I'm going to grab some of the dark orange. Trying to go around that piece of wood. I'm now rinsing the paint out of my brush and drying it off. And I'm using this clean, dry brush to kind of soften the top edges of some of this paint. That way it has a chance to kind of blend in with the background so it doesn't look so out of place. I'm going to soak up any puddling paint before I move on to the fox and pine needles. And I do want to add a little bit of a real rich black at the very bottom. This is actually my Payne's Gray. At the very bottom of where some of these grasses are. I can also use that ultramarine blue and gray mixture towards the top, just to ensure some of these new masked grass blades have a chance to show up and shine. If you don't layer paint on top of your masking fluid, there's no point in really applying it. And that dry top edge, we just use a damp brush with some water to blend that top edge in with the background. So right now, this area where the grasses are, it looks very dark, but once we lift all that masking fluid, it's going to brighten up and look really fun. I'm always soaking up the puddles so we don't get really built up pigment edges on our shapes. I am now going to mix up a very dark green, and it's going to involve sap green, some of the Payne's gray, and some of that ultramarine blue. So it's a very dark color. Once I have this color mixed up, I'm going to use a small number 2 round brush. And I'm going to first identify where the branches of these evergreens are. Now I'm going to hold my brush more vertical, and I'm going to add darker pine needles right on top, kind of pulling down at a diagonal towards the branch. If you find that in some areas of your background, your colors are getting camouflaged, you have the option to kind of darken up your paint color so it shows up more. Or you can just layer your color. I'm trying not to be so heavy-handed with the needle texture that I cover up all those fun, bright highlights that were a result of the masking fluid. And I am trying to be aware of my negative space. It's okay to let your pine needles overlap each other. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. Once you're happy with your evergreens, you can then rinse your brush. And I want you to get some of that really watered down gray so we can add some definition to the furs on the neck of the fox. So if you'll recall, we do have some masking fluid there. And I'm just kind of creating little groupings of darker fur texture that kind of go down at a soft diagonal. I'm also going to use this dark blue-gray to add some additional details to the face. So I want to darken up the area of the mouth, but rather than painting a straight line, I'm doing small little tick marks so it looks like fur is overlapping from the top lip to the bottom. I also want to use this dark blue-gray on the top edge of the ear But if I can maintain it, I would love to have just a thin area of white at the top edge, just so it looks like the ear has a little bit of a backlit glow. I'm going to get a darker black on my brush just to add a little bit more contrast to this ear fur. I'm going to also use this really dark black on the left ear, but this is a different angle for the ear, so it's a much more narrow shape. And I'm trying to keep at least a thin area on the top and left edge untouched with the black paint, so it looks like it's backlit. I'm going to continue with this darker blue-gray mixture, and I'm going to create some darker fur textures on the inside of the ear. Because these are longer hairs, I am going to be doing little dashed lines so that the outside shape has some texture to it. I'm going to continue with this dark blue gray above the eye, really keeping my pressure very, very light. So I have the chance to get these thin lines and small shapes. I have this soft blue-gray that I'm going to use to kind of indicate that darker fur that comes down from the eye of the fox. Keeping that line textured. I'm now going to use the darker orange and blue mixture, which looks more like a brown. And I want to just capture some of the shadows that are in this area of the ear. Anytime I'm painting animals, I am paying attention to the direction of the fur. So it's a slow process, but it's worth it in the end. There's some fur texture that comes down off the back of the ear, but it kind of creates this vertical line indicating the back of the head. So just watch your angles and pause once in a while. Give your eyes times to study the photo. I'm going to continue with this dark brown in between the ears to give a little bit more contrast. I'm also going to use this dark brown to indicate just some small fur textures on the forehead and upper brow. Notice how small my marks are, though. I am just barely grazing the top surface of the paper. One of the things I've learned with animals is a lot of times on the face, there's bristle fur, which is very, very short. And one of the ways I like to paint it is to do little tiny dots. So I essentially am creating shadows with the use of pointillism. So just little dots with the end of my brush to indicate that bristle fur that is really, really short. And then as that fur and shadow become lighter, I just widen the gap between my dots. I'm now going to rinse that brown out of my brush and I'm going to get that cadmium orange. I'm wiping away the excess so my brush isn't overloaded. And I just want to get some more vibrant color on the head of this fox. So I'm using that cadmium orange and layering it. I'm going to use this cadmium orange to kind of go down the center of the head to align with the top of the nose. I'm going to come up from the end of my shadows near that forward eye, just a straight line up before it curves back over the brow. I'm going to brighten up the orange that is above the eye. On the very back edge of the head, I'm just going to add a little bit more of a darker orange. As I go down along the bridge of the nose, I'm just doing little dots and dashes so my paint stroke isn't too wide, but also has a lot of texture to it. I'm going to get that blue-gray on my brush. I'm going to add a layer to the fox's nose. I'm starting at the left edge, being careful not to get too wide with the nose. And then as I near the light source, I'm going to rinse my brush. And I'm going to use a clean, barely damp brush to kind of pull that color to finish the shape of the nose. And I'm trying to maintain a thin sliver of white on that back edge. I'm going to use the cadmium yellow for the first layer on the eyes. Eyes require a lot of layers and drawing in between each layer, so I have to take my time with them and try not to rush. I'm going to return to that cadmium orange, and I'm just going to give a little bit more definition to the shape of the orange fur beneath the fox's eye. The fur here is shorter in length, so I'm just doing small little tick marks. I'm going to use a softer version of the orange with the blue. So it's kind of the more dull orange, but not the brown. And I'm going to use this softer orange just to indicate some of the fur that's on the inside of the ear. I'm going to do that to both ears. There are some softer oranges. I'm now going to add some fur texture to the back neck. This is the orange that is kind of close to a brown, but it's a darker color. And I want to maintain the lighter fur on the outside far left edge. So I don't want to go all the way to the left edge because I don't want to darken that up. So I'm kind of giving myself a visual boundary by going down this left edge That way I know to keep the dark colors out of that zone. And I can now just continue to follow that fur direction. Trying not to create patterns and trying to change the length of my brush strokes while maintaining some of that negative space. This dark fur kind of comes down in a narrow line along this left edge near the leg. I'm going to continue to use this darker orange to indicate the orange fur that's more in shadow beneath the chest and on the back leg. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. I'm now going to skip an area where there's a lot of white fur on the chest, and I'm coming into kind of this fur that's behind this forward leg. I now want to darken up the fur that is on the stomach behind this leg, just to really push it forward. The stomach fur is longer in length, so I want to adjust my paint strokes to match that. I'm going to continue with this dark brown going across the belly, but I want to be mindful of the white fur that is on the belly. So there's a narrow bit of white fur I don't want to cover up. I'm going to keep using this dark fur on this back leg. Again, being mindful of the white fur that's above. As I get down on the leg, towards the lower half of the leg, the fur length changes to be much shorter. So I'm going to continue with this dark fur texture along this hip of the back leg. I'm going to switch to my cadmium orange. I'm going to brighten up some of the fur here along the body. I'm also going to darken up some of the fur that is up against that white fur on the lower neck. There's a thin narrow of darker orange fur along the back edge of that front leg. I'm going to continue with this cadmium orange along the back of the fox, just to brighten some of that area up. I'm going to use some of this bright orange along the tail. I'm also going to use this bright orange along the back edge of the tail as well. The tail is quite fluffy, so my paint strokes are going to be longer. I'm going to use some of that watered down, lighter orange just to ease this transition along the back of my fox. So I'm basically tinting the left edge of some of this masking fluid. I'm now going to use that orange that is practically a brown on the tail. I'm going to use this dark brown throughout the tail, but I don't want to be too heavy-handed with it. So I'm leaving quite a bit of spacing between my brush strokes. I'm now going to use the darker Payne's Gray. So it's more of a black. And I'm going to go to this hip area on the fox and just darken up a few thin areas. I'm going to water this down, this blue-gray mixture. That way I can use this soft gray to darken up some of the fur that's on this back hip here. As I get closer to the right edge, I allow more spacing between my brush strokes. I'm going to also use this darker Payne's Gray to push some of the shadows on that back leg. I'm going to continue to use this dark gray on the tail. I want to really kind of push the contrast. So right behind the rear end, I'm darkening it up. Now I'm using the lighter gray to create little clusters of just a few darker furs on the tail. Now I'm going to use the really dark Payne's gray, which is close to a black, to really push the contrast of the underside of this tail. I'm now going to use the dark black to add contrast to the fox's legs. Now you want this color to be dark, but you don't want it so dark that it's chalky in appearance or thick in texture. You still want it to be watercolors and have some transparency. So I'm starting off with just kind of getting the fur on the front of the lower side of the leg darker and keeping it just above the toes, just so I don't lose sight of the toes. The fur on this lower portion of the leg is more of a bristle fur, so dots can be very helpful to imply that short fur texture. I'm going to go to the next leg. Keeping the dark color above the toes if I know where they're at. Going to the lifted paw. Now on the top edge of this bent paw, there's a lot of little bristled fur there, so I want to be mindful of that. So I want to find kind of where the joint is, just above the paw. Follow that joint down. Imagine a curve that comes down and stops before that right edge. And then it's behind that we have a lot of bristled fur, so little dots together to create these shapes. Then below that joint, it's more of a solid color, but I still want to be very mindful of where the toes are. So if I need to come in and kind of indicate where those toes are, so I don't accidentally go too far with my blacks. And I'm trying to maintain that lighter color along that right edge. Trying to draw where the end of this foot is before I come in with my blacks. By maintaining the light color on the bottom edge of the toes, that's going to help ensure that that foot remains a focal point and doesn't completely camouflage in with the rear leg. So now that I have that front foot established, I can come in and get some darks on this back leg. I'm going to use these really rich blacks on a few areas of the back tail. I'm going to use some of these dark blacks on the face. I want to kind of darken up where some of these furs are coming out of the ear. I want to darken up some of the color that is along the top of the eye. I also want to darken up some of the nose. So when we darken up the nose, we want to try and create a little curve that leads from the very back edge of the nose, comes forward, and then creates the first nostril. Now, from the center of the nose up, we have a line that kind of separates the two halves. So if you kind of create this little shape that we have here, we can then create the nostril that is closest to us. And then with a thin line on the back edge, we can create and indicate the next nostril. This is such a small scale that I'm painting this on, so it's very hard to paint details like this on a small scale. I probably should have gone larger. I'm going to give that some space to dry, and I'm going to continue with my dark blacks around the fox's eyes. So on this rear eye, I want to kind of just give a hint of where maybe the lashes of the animal might be, and just the real bottom edge of the eye. On this forward eye, I want to darken up the back and give a little bit of thin liner along the bottom of the eye. I also want to use this dark black just to darken up parts of the mouth. I'm going to be using this dark black to indicate some of the little spots on the cheek of the fox where the whiskers will be coming out later. On the very back edge of where these whiskers will be, the fur is darker, but it's that bristle fur, so I'm just dotting some of that fur texture in. I'm going to use some of that cadmium orange to brighten up some of the eye. So the brow is going to create a shadow on the top edge of the eye. So I need to darken that up. And I need to do that on both eyes. I'm going to use some of this darker orange just to layer below the eye. and above the brow. And then also along the side of the nose. All right. I'm now going to use some of that darker orange again, just to give some fur texture beneath this rear ear. Oops, there was some black on my sponge. I'm not even going to mess with that black line. We're just going to call it a part of the fox. I am going to get some black on my brush and give just a little bit more detail to this forward ear. Just darkening up some of the blacks if they look a little too grayed out. All right, the nose has had time to dry. So I'm going to get a lighter gray on my brush. And I just want to darken up this back half of the nose. I'm also going to use this lighter gray to indicate where some of the whiskers are coming out of the white cheek. Now I'm going to return my focus to the eyes. I'm going to use some of that brown orange to darken up just small parts of the eye. Soaking up puddling paint so it's easier to control. A little bit of light orange along parts of this ear. I'm going to use that orange and brown mixture just to darken up some of the fur on the head here. Some of this dark fur is kind of coming up from the tear duct area of the fox's eye. Now that the brown on the eye has completely dried, I'm going to get some of that dark black. I am going to make sure that I wipe away the excess paint and even go a step as to wipe off on my sponge just to ensure I can get this ever so narrow pupil on the fox's eye. I'm now going to use some of this dark black for the fur on the neck. I'm going to use this dark black in just the areas where I had some dark gray, but I'm going to be more selective with it, so not as heavy-handed. And I'm allowing spacing between my brush strokes. Now I'm going to get some of that watered down gray. I need to make sure it's light enough. This is too dark, so I need to add more water to it. So this is the value we want. Just a really soft gray, nothing too intense. And I'm going to remove the masking fluid first, now that my black is all dry. And with this really soft gray, I'm going to be very mindful of this bright white area. I want to maintain that. But I want to get some of the fur on this shadow area a little darker. So I'm still keeping that negative space between my brush strokes. Especially underneath that little neck ruffle. And I just want to add a few soft grays to the areas of the white so it at least resembles some texture. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. I'm also going to use this soft gray on the back end of the tail. Now it's time for us to add some color to the wood and rocks. Sometimes it's nice to just add some of the darks first, just so you know where you're at so you don't get lost. So I'm going to create some of the darks that are along the bottom edge of the wood. So I'm using just really dark Payne's gray. And I'm kind of dragging my brush in the direction of the wood grain. I'm allowing my hand to kind of shake and wobble because I feel like that's just going to add to the texture of the wood. I want to come to the top edge of this little forward piece of wood to indicate where the separation is in the split wood. That way I can come to this back edge and know where to apply some of that wood grain and shadow. There is a wood knot on this little log. So I'm kind of creating some circular textures in this area. There's also a little knot that's kind of up near the foot, but doesn't go all the way to the top. So again, I'm allowing my hand to kind of shake and wobble. I'm allowing my lines to be uneven because these are all things that will just add to the texture. Now on this forward face of the rock, we have a lot of masking fluid, which is fine, but we want to now go around the rock to indicate some of the darker colors on the back side. So I'm essentially finding the edges of all my main subjects. Now I'm going to even add some of the darker shadows that I have on my rocks just to make it easier so we don't lose our place. So there's a narrow rock in between here. And for the rock texture in the darkest shadow area, I'm just going to do some stippling. So just kind of dotting some irregular little shapes in a cluster where I want that shadow to be. I'm now going to follow this large foreground rock, and I want to put a dark line just above it right where these grass blades are, because there's a rock in the background here that is quite dark. So I am just going to add some dark color in here to be behind those grass blades and to kind of indicate where that separation is. So doing some of these dark shadows just helps ensure that we don't get completely lost. I'm also going to use this dark gray to indicate where the toes are of my fox, because I have not finished those yet. But it would be nice to know where the foot is and the details of it. All right, I'm going to continue to use this dark black just to indicate the top edge of that forward rock so I can kind of figure out where I'm at. All right, so now this Payne's Gray is a staining pigment. So it will move a little under a lot of water, but very minimal. So the benefit of a staining pigment is I can kind of create some of these details, give myself some guidelines so I don't lose where I'm at, and I can do a big wash of water and drop in some wet color, and it will help me kind of avoid getting lost in my subject. So for really complex subjects where you're concerned the color is going to hide your pencil lines, this is what I do. I grab a staining color and I try to establish where all of my really dark darks are with either a Payne's Gray or some other staining pigment, like a purple. And I basically block in the darkest shadows. That way, when I apply my water, I'm not going to get lost. All right, so this color is now on here. I'm going to use my large number 10 round. And I'm applying color over all the rocks and the wood. So I'm staying out of the background and I'm staying out of the fox. And when you do this, you may see some of your Payne's Gray moving just a smidge, but it will be very minimal. Trying to stay out of the fox's feet if possible. Now that I have water over everything, I make sure there's no puddles. And now I can start adding additional colors. So in some areas of my rocks, I want there to be some soft grays, but I also want the illusion of moss. So I'm using that cadmium orange with the added blue, so it's kind of closer to a brown. And in some areas, I want to add some orange color, so it kind of reads like moss. We also have some reflective color that is, believe it or not, bouncing off the color of our fox onto the wood below. It's not a strong color, so use water to kind of soften it. But we do want some little hints of orange underneath our fox. Some areas I definitely need more of a darker gray. I can add some brown to it. So I'm going through on the underside of my wood where it's all in shadow and adding some of those darks. I can use some of the darker gray to add some shadows to the rocks. When it comes to the rocks, though, I don't just smooth it all out. I kind of dab in my darker grays just so there's some texture. And I'll be doing some dry brush techniques on top of these rocks and wood just to finalize the texture a bit more. Just working with that lighter gray to try and get some of the darker color in parts of the wood. Still working around those feet. All right, I'm going to hit this with the blow dryer and then we're going to do just wet on dry brushing for final texture. And that should complete our subject. Now, in order to get texture on the wood, I'm going to use a dry brush technique. So I'm going to make sure I have a clean brush that is dry. I'm going to go into my darker blue-gray mixture. I'm going to wipe away the excess paint. And I'm going to go a step further and do a light tap on my sponge to actually dry it off. My goal is to hold my brush with the side profile and drag it across the texture of the paper, leaving this dry brush technique. So I am going to hold my brush parallel to the paper, be feather light, and I'm dragging the side profile with a light touch across the surface that I want rough. I did a little bit of a lighter blue-gray to start off with. I like to do this with a variety of colors. I'm now going to go to the darker Payne's Gray mixture. Again, sticking with the side profile of my brush, keeping it very light so that my brush is basically skimming across the highest points of the paper. So it helps to have paper with texture like a cold press or a rough press. I'm going to do the same thing with this smaller piece of wood that's right in front. Dragging the side profile, letting it skim the top surface of the paper. I'm also using that dark Payne's Gray. Now I need to give that wood some space to dry, so I might as well move on to the rocks. The rocks, it's essentially the same thing. Dip your brush in the paint, wipe away the excess so your brush is only semi-loaded. And you don't need to do it everywhere. You can just kind of pick and choose the highest points of texture. I'm not worried about the masking fluid on the dry grasses. Just going right over top of that. I'm going to use that darker orange that is almost a brown, and I'm going to just add some texture for the moss on the back side of this rock. So this is the area where the moss is more in shadow. I like to hold my brush more vertical and just use the very end of it to create these fun moss-like textures. Now, your moss and tint of orange may be in a different location on your rocks, and that's okay. I want you to adapt your textures to where your first layer of colors dried and just make those the areas where you have moss on your rocks. I'm trying to darken up some of the background around this rear rock. I'm now going to use that Payne's Gray, it's more of a medium value, to just slowly start building some of the larger shadows that are on this rock. And again, your shadows don't have to be in the same place. So just adjust for your painting and your taste. I like to vary the direction that I hold my brush so that the paint strokes aren't all the same. I'm going to darken up the wood on the underside of this log. So I'm just going through and adding more wood texture where I feel like it might be lacking or lightened up too much. I'm going to grab that dark orange that has the added blue and it's almost a brown tone. And I'm going to go to the feet of my wolf. And right now I'm just going to give them a coat of this darker brown. And when this dries, I can selectively come back and darken up the blacks where I need to and pay attention to the claws. So meanwhile, I might as well just use this darker orange brown mixture, doing some stippling on the lower portion of the legs just to refine some of those shadows. I also find it really helpful to kind of step away from paintings like this that are a little bit more time consuming. Give yourself a couple hour break, come back to it, and all of a sudden you'll find that you have the patience for it again and you won't be rushing those important details. I'm going to give those legs some space so they can dry. Meanwhile, I'm going to use the rubber cement pickup to remove the masking fluid from the dry grasses. And you can see once you remove the masking fluid how fun layering it can be. I might have to darken up some of the shadows on the rock down below, so I'm not going down there to lighten the mask or remove the masking fluid just yet. I can remove the masking fluid from the rocks though. It's a great way to kind of figure out where you might need to adjust, add more darks and so forth. I'm going to check on the paws. Some of those are still damp, so I'm going to give them space and just remove the masking fluid from other areas of the wood. I'm going to get some darker Payne's gray and push the shadows on some of these rear rocks. I'm going to also just give more definition to the underside wood and the top of this rock. I'm going to mix up some really dark Payne's gray so I can use it on the claws of each little toe. I'm going to make sure I use a quality brush with a good point. This is just a number 2 round. And I'm going to darken up where each of those claws on the toes should be, or toes should be. They don't need to be perfect. Avoid going back and trying to perfect them, because you will, in the end, just make them bigger and bigger and bigger. So be okay with your painting looking like a painting where the claws may not be absolutely perfect. Just give them some space. Once you've identified the claws on each toe, then you can come back and decide whether or not to add some additional black fur lower down on the foot. I'm going to water down a blue-gray so it's just very, very soft. I'm going to use this lighter blue-gray just to give a very faint tint of color to some of the highlights on the wood, just so they don't look too bright. I'm going to do the same thing on just parts of the rock highlights. If there's anything that needs a tint just to be dulled down a little bit, I just come in with this really faint blue. There's a gap between the rocks and the wood. I'm just going to add some orange back here so it looks like we can kind of see some plants from the backside. And then lastly, for final details, I'm going to use a little bit of this bleed-proof white just to add some highlights to the eyes and make sure I establish some of the bright white furs where I need them on the fox. So I'm going straight into this bleed-proof white, and I'm wiping away the excess really well. I'm also going to step further and just tapping my sponge to make sure it's not overloaded with paint. I'm going to come into the eye and add a couple very small little highlights to add some life to the eye. I can add a little highlight on the nose if I need to. On the back side of the fox, I want to give a hint of maybe some whiskers that the light is hitting. So just using that bleed-proof white to add some of those whiskers. Now I'm going to tint this bleed-proof white with some of my Payne's gray, so it's more of a soft gray. And I'm going to come into the underbelly of the fox just to make sure I have kind of this white underbelly established. I feel like I lost some of that in my painting. And same with the front portion of this rear leg. I want there to be some whites, but since they're in shadow, it's a little bit more of a grayed out white. Making sure I'm happy with the little white chest hairs. I'm going to add some wispy, thinner whites to the end of this fluffy tail on the fox. I can add just some white highlights to some of the fur towards the back of the fox. So at this point, I'm starting to run out of things to do. I'm sure if I give it, 24 hours, I'll come up with some other details that I didn't capture and keep working on it. But for the most part, I feel like we've covered all of the essentials. I hope you've learned a lot from this tutorial. If you do it, I would really love to see your finished paintings. Feel free to reach out to me and leave a comment in the video. Let me know what you thought of this tutorial and the subject, and we'll just kind of go from there. You guys have a fantastic day.